Welcome once again into the Radiopedia Reading Room, a podcast unconcerned with books or poetry, tea leaves or palmistry. This is a radiology podcast. My name is Andrew Dixon, and joining me, he's always very keen to interrupt my intro spiel. It's my co-host Frank Gaillard, but he'll have to wait even longer today to cut in because we're joined by special guest, MSK radiologist, software developer, and all-round health tech geek. It's Daniel Fascia. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much. That was quite an intro.
Did you know, Dan, I was so excited for this episode that I turned up to this recording session 168 hours early.
Did.
And that's actually a new personal record because my previous one was turning up to dinner with Henry Knipe, who's our editorial manager or director.
Yep.
I turned up over 2.5 hours early due to a vague wanting to be there early and getting my calendar mixed up. And by the time he turned up, I wasn't drunk, but I was pretty close to it, having had numerous pre-dinner drinks.
The thing I find most disturbing, Gaillard, about you turning up a week early is that you accessed our little planning document a few minutes before you thought we were about to start. And you didn't seem bothered at all that there was nothing there. You were like, oh, whatever. I guess we're just winging this episode. And in fact, actually, all you added to the document was, I have a knock-knock joke to tell.
I do have a knock-knock joke.
Oh, gosh.
Are you ready?
Are we doing it?
Knock-knock.
Who's there, Frank?
Interrupting cow.
Interrupting
Moo.
cow. Very good. I suspect we've all heard that one. Dan, you've probably heard that one before.
A few times.
But the topic for this episode is radiologist interruptions. So you've successfully interrupted me in more than one way already, so it's quite apt. Now, Dan, you've kindly agreed to join us today to help us chat about radiologist interruptions in the reporting room, a special topic request from a listener named Turig. But before we get into that, now it's me doing the interrupting of things. You've arrived on an episode with a numerical milestone associated with it. This is episode number 50. You excited, Dan?
Wow, 50 already.
Oh, I never thought we'd get here, to be honest. And given that we started doing this weekly and then we dropped to fortnightly and maybe one day we'll drop to, what's every 3 weeks? Is there a word for that? Anyway, at some point, maybe we'll never get to 100.
Just keep approaching that, what is it called, an asymptote or something.
Yes. Zeno's paradox.
Now, Dan, this may seem like a very random question, Dan, but do you have any secret creative project outside of radiology that you'd be a bit embarrassed if it ever saw the light of day? You don't need to give me specifics. Anything come to mind?
I think the dumbest one was when I was back at medical school and a friend and I were into composing music and we were watching the Eurovision Song Contest, as I'm sure you do. And we thought that the British entry was pretty rubbish and that we had a shot at it next year. So we actually went ahead and composed the song. And went as far as to master it. We held auditions for female singers, probably a cheap shot to try and meet more girls. But we did actually record the track and submit it, and didn't get selected. Got nowhere.
So it's lost forever.
Yeah, it's lost to time. I could maybe dig it out someday, but
that sounds good.
It sounds like a podcast extra.
Now, the reason I ask about creative endeavors, Dan, is because listeners of our podcast will know that Frank made the mistake of telling us in a very early episode that he once wrote a Harry Potter knockoff novel, and I've been teasing him about it ever since. Yes. And I joked that we should do a reading from it in our 50th episode. Well, Frank, the time has come.
No, it's not happening. The manuscript, if you want to call it that, it's unfinished, it's unpublished, and it's safely locked away in my Google Drive somewhere.
Not as securely locked as you might think, mate, because I got a little surprise for you and our listeners.
Please.
I might save it until later in the episode because we've already banged on enough up the top here. So how about we get into the actual topic for this episode and prolong your anxiety, Gaillard, for even longer. Now, I imagine all three of us have first-hand experience of this problem of radiologists being bombarded by interruptions every day. We've probably each observed some changes over time in this area, and perhaps witnessed the implementation of some strategies to reduce it. So, to facilitate our little chat today, I thought I might break the discussion down into 3 parts. Yeah, I've done a bit of work here. So,
Wow.
the first part I want to focus on is defining the problem. So, what types of radiologist interruptions are there? What volume of interruptions are occurring, and what are the impacts of these? Then, in the second part, I thought we might share some strategies that either we've implemented in our own departments or that have been described in the literature. And then for the final part, I thought we could maybe speculate a bit on the future, how interruptions might change going forward, what technologies could come into play to assist with the issue. Hopefully, you're both happy with that plan.
Sounds good.
Very much. I think us speculating about things we know very little about is exactly what you and I do, Dixon. So hopefully, Dan, you can steer us a little bit.
No, it sounds like a great plan, and I hope Tarek's happy as well.
Oh yeah, he better be happy because I've even done a literature search for this episode.
Wow.
In fact, I noticed when I was doing the literature search that most publications in this area are very recent, several in 2024 already.
Well, it's a hot topic, and Tarek was definitely onto it.
He was indeed. All right, so let's jump into part one. So this is the types of radiologist interruptions, the volume of interruptions, and the impacts. To begin, perhaps, Dan, you can brainstorm out aloud some types of interruptions that you've observed in reporting rooms yourself, and I'll see if that matches my little literature search.
Sure thing. So, like all things medicine, or maybe it's just an MSK radiologist thing, I like to classify it and break it down into a classification system. So, I've had a little bit of a think about this in advance. I like to divide it into 3 main types of sabotage that happen, or interruptions, sorry.
Nice.
So the first one really is internal sabotage, and that would be interruptions that come from within your own radiology department. So it could be things like admin staff or radiographers who need to ask you questions about things, particularly non-radiological tasks, such as protocoling, responding to clinician queries, complaints. And in the UK NHS, there's a lot of, can you report something right now, because it's a bit of an age debt and they need it imminently for the clinic that happens in 10 minutes. They are genuine tasks that need doing, but they show a lack of sensitivity towards what you're doing at the time of the actual interruption. The next one, I guess, is external sabotage, and it's a more difficult one because it's outside of your department, from people that don't know what the hell radiologists do and when we're working versus just staring at the screen.
Quite a few of our listeners are outside of radiology, Dan, so they should listen into this external sabotage section.
Yes.
So, I mean, they can be physical visits. I mean, we all know the rivaling surgery gangs who bring their squad to visit the radiology department. But, I mean, they can also be individual visitors with specific queries. And I just find the most mundane and annoying of these visits is the one where they just put their head in and go, hey, do you know where Andrew is today? Is he in?
Yeah. Especially when there is a roster that everyone can access and they can see where you are or where you're supposed to be, and they're not even in remotely the right place.
Yeah. And in the UK, our new big problem is non-medical referrers, who are groups of allied health professionals who've newly been given radiology requesting rights. And so quite frequently we find that their requests are misdirected and they need tons more advice and guidance than the traditional requesting groups. But they really seem to prey on the radiologists for that advice, because I think that we can just consistently be found at a desk more than other doctors who are itinerant.
A captive audience.
I agree.
I mean, I think that remote reporting and hiding in or protected offices do offer some kind of level of solution to this. And I think it's something we're going to talk about a bit later when we go through solutions. But you do need to strike a balance of being visible for the right high-value consultations as a clinical radiologist, yet have time to report. The third category I just want to raise, because it's something we need to fix ourselves, is self-sabotage. And this is a really growing problem, and it's probably worse for us millennials and younger, who just are more susceptible to distractions and concentration at mundane tasks for long periods of times. And That really feels like a diminishing skill set in an age where we're used to a lot of automation and instant results.
I love the fact that you think that I'm a millennial. I think that's great.
I think you sneak in, don't you, Frank?
No.
He considers himself Gen Alpha. Skibbity. I think that's the word that my daughter's been using recently. No idea what it means. In fact, I think it means nothing.
Yeah, that's about right.
The kind of things that catch us out, regardless of generation, I think, are phones, instant messaging apps, and actually constantly looking things up. But also the expectation that if we do engage in instant messaging and chat, the queries are dealt with instantly rather than having to wait for returns on communication. Because everything's just happening at such an accelerated pace. I think that does make it more stressful and risky with making mistakes in reporting. Some of the technologies themselves really promote interruptions as well, which is a bit unfortunate. Later on, we're going to talk about instant messaging methods, but you've got to be careful how you set them up because things like pop-up alerts just interrupt you even more. And increasingly, we're using co-working spaces rather than having nice, luxurious offices or quiet cubicles. And it all just adds up to a heightened risk of mistakes, inconsistencies in reports, and a lower productivity, whilst at the same time feeling more stressed with what you're doing.
When I was doing my literature search earlier today, I got a little buzz in my pocket, looked down at my phone, and it just said, Uber Eats, 50% discount or something. I was like, oh, right when I was working on interruptions. Crazy. I think your little sabotage classification is actually better than any of the ones that I found in the literature, to be honest, Dan. And not just because it reminds me of the Beastie Boys song. Do you know that one? With regards to the self-sabotage, which is not actually something that's covered in the literature very much, I've made an observation from my own behavior. When I get interrupted in the middle of reading a study, by internal or external sabotage, to use your terms, Dan, instead of going straight back to the study, I'll often go, well, I've been interrupted. I might as well just check my email or Twitter or whatever. So I find myself defaulting to that almost, and I really shouldn't. So there's like an interruption amplification effect that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same, Andrew. I think it all comes down to switching cost. I think that's the term that's used in the debunked multitasking sort of myth. Back when I was a kid, people that were highly productive were always banging on about how they were able to multitask and that was a really good thing to be able to do. And I think should now really be aware that multitasking is sort of a myth, and there's lots of literature showing that you're actually underproductive if you try and do more than one thing at once. And that whenever you get interrupted, whether from whatever source, you take a while to then go back into the thing that you were doing. So you don't just lose track of where you were, but you lose a chunk of time, and it opens the opportunity for your mind to wander or latch on to another task, whether that's email or something else. I think that's probably the strongest reason to reduce interruptions is that derailment of thought and practice.
And I've actually got a nice little reference later on in the discussion that relates to that. Let's talk about the volume of interruptions. So my impression is that they seem to be increasing in frequency, and that's probably why the literature is increasing in frequency too. And it kind of largely mirrors, in my experience, an increase in the number of studies that are being performed without really a proportional increase in the number of radiologists to report them. We're scanning faster, we have more scanners, we're keeping them open after hours and on weekends to try and meet this kind of insatiable clinical need for scanning. Every patient needs a scan. And that results in more and more interruptions as the radiologist sits really at the whim of this whole big system. There was one study that measured, to give a number to it, 11 interruptions per hour for a radiologist. Obviously, that depends on the setting, but that's the kind of level we're talking about at times. There was a study in 2022 conducted by researchers at the Nationwide Children's Hospital, published in Current Problems in Diagnostic Radiology, and that
is that the name? Is that the name of a journal? Current Problems.
Current Problems.
It's fantastic.
It is good, isn't it?
Is there a journal of past problems?
Yeah, past problems.
We should start a journal of why I get stuff wrong all the time.
Or massive successes in diagnostic radiology. So they observed 13 pediatric radiologists and found overall that radiologists were spending 52% of their time interpreting studies. That's good. But 29% of their time dealing with active interruptions and 18% of their time involved in passive interruptions. So almost half their time was spent on interruptions rather than reporting. And active for them was interruptions that the radiologists themselves initiated, and passive were interruptions initiated by other people. And they found that the highest frequency of interruptions was observed, not surprisingly, during that mid-morning period and mid-afternoon, when the clinical teams are getting back to work.
That's also when you get up to go get a coffee. Does that count as an interruption? It probably does, right?
And they found 90% of the interruptions, this is interesting, 90% of the interruptions lasted 3 minutes or less, and 70% lasted 1 minute or less. So it's, lots of very short interruptions.
Moo.
Just like that, indeed. There was also a study in JACR back in February this year, actually, that found radiology residents experienced, on average, 46 interruptions during a night shift, which is 3 per hour. And most of those, the most common interruption at least, were protocol requests.
Yeah, protocol requests are something that can really be solved in two ways. The first one would be empowering the radiographers to deal with most of the protocols, and switching to asynchronous communication. I think we'll come back to these points a bit later.
Yeah, we will indeed. And 46 interruptions during a night shift, I reckon, in my anecdotal experience anyway, at my hospital, I reckon it'd be even more than that. Particularly in those evening hours, that kind of 6 p.m. till 11 p.m., the number of interruptions is crazy. And what we have at the Alfred is there's always two radiology registrars in the room and also a radiologist until 10 o'clock. And one of the registrars essentially takes the phones, does all of the answering the phone, dealing with people, protocoling, that kind of thing. And the other one is dedicated more to actually reporting the scans, and the radiologist is there to obviously report scans. But essentially it takes one person just to deal with the interruptions in that kind of time period. And the last thing I have here for part one, team, is to discuss the impacts of interruptions. So obviously there's a loss of time effect. That's pretty easy. So from that study of pediatric radiologists that I just mentioned before, they found that interruptions increased the average time a radiologist needed to read a study by 1 minute for x-rays, 2 minutes for ultrasounds, 6 minutes for CTs, and 10 minutes for MRIs. There was also a nice study published in Cognitive Research back in 2017, which relates to what we were talking about earlier, Frank, where they had participants search chest CT scans for nodules. And during half the cases, they were interrupted deliberately by a series of true-false maths equations that they needed to solve. And for the other half, they weren't.
Yeah.
And they used eye tracking software, and they found that there was a time cost in addition to the interruption themselves, and that was indeed driven by impaired memory of which regions of the lungs they'd already searched, and therefore they were repeating their search pattern over again.
Yeah, so I think that's a huge problem, and I'm generally not a huge fan of having a very specific way of looking at every study. I don't have a pattern for everything, but for some studies, and epilepsy is one of them, and CTA cows, arch to vertex is another one, I have a very specific way that I look at every single scan because they do take a while. And if you get interrupted, you then either have to sort of guess where you were up to and start again, or you get into this really uncomfortable feeling where, and I'm sure you've both experienced it, where you've been staring at a study for a while, you're not really sure how much you've been looking at it, but you get to a point where you think, I've probably looked at this long enough. I must have looked at all of it. So it's right to report. And so there having a pattern can mean that as long as you just remember where in the pattern you were up to, you can just pick up from there.
There's doom scrolling in social media, but I think there's also doom scrolling in radiology where you just, scroll and scroll, but you haven't actively engaged your mind, and you're hoping osmosis will write the report for you.
It's the radiology equivalent of when you read a novel and your mind wanders and you're reading text, but you realize, oh my God, I haven't paid attention to the last 3 paragraphs.
I can read Harry Potter actually to my daughter as she's going to sleep, and I'm not taking any of it in. I'm
Yeah.
just reading, but none of it is going to. I have no idea what I read at the end of it. And she's like, "What do they mean when they said this?" And I'm like, "I can't remember
That's a
that."
very good question.
So time lost is not the only impact, not surprisingly. So performance and well-being are other things that have been documented in the literature. There was a study in JACR back in December 2023 that measured this in breast imaging. So they had 9 breast radiologists report multiple sets of 75 mammograms, either without interruption or with interruptions, and they compared the results for the reader, and they found that recall rates increased in the interrupted reading sessions, so 35% versus 31%. Accuracy was worse in the interrupted reading sessions, 69% versus 73%. And importantly, during the interrupted sessions, the readers reported feeling busier, encountered higher levels of cognitive demand, experienced elevated levels of physical fatigue, and expressed lower levels of satisfaction with their performance.
Can I be a little bit contrarian, Dixon? Because,
You
look,
can.
I'm 100% on board with the idea that interruptions are generally bad. But the subtext in at least some, if not most, of the literature out there is that anything that a radiologist does other than sitting and reporting like some kind of battery hen is an interruption. And I think it's really important to recognize that some interruptions are probably the most valuable thing we do during a day. And particularly going forward with the rise of AI, probably those kind of activities are actually where we can value add the most. When a senior clinician comes and seeks you out to discuss a case, that's way more important and valuable and unique than what you do just by reporting yet another meningioma follow-up scan. So I think when we read these stats, etc., and when we craft our responses to interruptions, we need to make sure that we don't get rid of the good kinds of interruptions at the same time as we get rid of the bad ones.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that there needs to be a recognition that interruption of reporting is not the only problem, and it's just interruption of tasks that we ought to be doing. So, valuable consultations are definitely part of a radiologist's work. But hey, how often do they get interrupted by yet another person who's shown up to the door to say, I need a protocol
Yes.
or something like that? So it's just interruptions in general, but I guess the most measurable one tends to be for reporting.
Guess what? We're up to part 2. So, this is where we can start to talk about strategies to reduce the negative impacts of interruptions. In terms of the literature out there, we have quite a few recent publications, as I mentioned, and you can kind of break them down into, and I'll just list these first, and then we can discuss each separately afterwards, hopefully. So, the first one is assigning a dedicated person to deal with most interruptions. So, like a vetting radiologist, duty radiologist, or a reading room assistant, are some of the terms used. The second one is telephone triage system. The next one is physical environment changes. And then the fourth category that I came up with is kind of education. And then the final one I have software and IT interventions. So switching to asynchronous communication methods like Teams. And then the last one was from a recent study. So integrated automatic examination assignment. But I think I might save this for part 3 rather than part 2 when we talk about the future.
So with that first one about a dedicated person, Dixon,
Mm-hmm.
at my hospital, we have what we call a liaison registrar who sits in what we call the dog box, which is a small office that is that shares a room with the front desk reception area and some of the bookings area. That person is at a little window where any question that is needed to be asked goes to them first. So no one's really allowed or encouraged to wander through the department seeking out radiologists to interrupt. They all have to go through that person. Now, it's not a great shift to be on, but everyone I've spoken to, and certainly my personal experience, has been that it's much better than it used to be. And even the registrars who do it recognize that by taking that bullet during that session, they then get interrupted far fewer times for the rest. Now, that's not internal, that's for external interruptions only. So, not radiographers or protocol questions. It's for external phone calls about when a scan's getting done, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have it too, and I think we call it duty radiologist, and I generally think it's the best and worst of ideas. I mean, as you allude to, it's absolute misery to be that person, but it is assumed that it's because you're making life better for the others who are getting on with their duties. But our experience is that it doesn't massively reduce interruptions on the others unless you go a step further and physically relocate the people who are not the duty dog to signal that they're in a private session. And the other factor about it is in an era of subspecialization, which is definitely the way we really work in the UK, it's not infrequent that the duty dog can't help with these highly specific queries that
Right.
get sent towards them, and they have to just forward them on to the protected subspecialists anyway.
Mm. Yeah, at the Alfred, our reporting rooms are very specific to each subspecialty. Whereas I know, Frank, for you, your hospital is still modality-based reporting rooms, and we found, that a single central duty registrar really didn't work for us, and we essentially kind of have to have one person per subspecialty doing that role, which is not really practical. In the end, it's the majority of these types of interruptions get directed through one of our subspecialty fellows in each area, which is not ideal because it takes away some of their learning opportunities. All right, with that in mind, there was a study published in Acta Radiologica. This is part of my literature review. I'm seamlessly integrating it in November 2022.
You're just name dropping now.
So they showed that the introduction of a duty radiologist to vet clinician inquiries in combination with moving inpatient CT reporting to a private, quiet room resulted in a substantial reduction in interruptions. In fact, an 82% reduction in the number of frank interruptions. That's once caused by you, Frank. Those resulting in basically moos that cut out all of moos. So frank interruptions, so those requiring the radiologist to abandon the task that they were performing, from a median of 6 per hour down to 1 per hour. So clearly, this liaison registrar, liaison radiologist, duty radiologist idea can work, particularly, I think, in those modality-based practices. There are also some papers actually about non-radiologists and non-radiology trainees performing this kind of role. So the so-called reading room assistant, particularly like for after hours and emergency type scenarios. And that involves people like medical students. So there's a study from April this year published in the European Journal of Radiology that assessed this in radiology resident on-call setting. So they trained medical students to take over non-image interpretation tasks and estimated that reading room assistance resulted in a net time saving of 101 minutes, that's 24%, during a 7-hour shift, and prevented a mean of 18 interruptions to the resident during the shift. You like my literature review? It's pretty good, isn't it?
There's some pretty big numbers.
It is pretty big. So I guess the issue here, though, is who wants that job long term, right? A med student might do this for a short while, but I imagine you're spending a lot of effort training them up, and you'd need a good system in place to keep it going. Plus, maybe this doesn't apply in some countries, but generally you need to pay people for this kind of task, right? Unpaid med student labor is not a great solution to our interruptions.
Yeah. I mean, training, or to use corporate speak, onboarding is really challenging to do it well. And there's always a period of time before someone gets trained enough to be useful in whatever task it is. And it's possible to do it, but generally finding someone who's smart enough to do this sort of job without having the background of a radiologist or a doctor or a radiology trainee means that they are smart enough to generally not want to stay long enough in that kind of role. And at least in the organizations I know well enough to see how it works, they see medical staff not so much as unpaid, but as already paid labor. And so you have this insane situation where you have some of the most highly paid people in the hospital system doing some really menial, meaning not a judgment here on the kind of person that does them, but just unskilled kind of tasks.
Mm.
But trying to get a business case across to hire a assistant is so horribly painful that the end result is that you end up radiologists answering the phone to redirect phone calls and check booking times.
Mm. Or me, on the rare instance where I'm reporting obstetric ultrasounds, I'm manually entering in the measurements for femur length, humeral length, biparietal diameter, and the dates and all those kind of things. So you can have errors that are involved in typing that in, and the absolute waste of time. They'd
Yeah.
prefer to not spend money on the technology, but instead pay a radiologist a very large amount to do that kind of task. That
You'd hope that these publications that you're referencing can actually act as the basis to justify a business case. But name a health system that has spare cash at the moment to employ anyone additional. And I think it's not even a question that the executive levels are stupid and don't understand that they could save money. It's just that there's no extra funds.
The next one on my list here is phone call triage. And certainly we've done some work on this at our hospitals, especially when we switched to subspecialty reporting rooms many years ago. So we found there was a bias towards people just calling what they thought was radiology and not thinking about the specific subspecialty that they wanted to connect with. So we did some work on separate phone lines and recorded messages to divert people away from, in particular, what we call the body reporting room, where the majority of first calls were heading during daytime hours. But phone triaging, it seems a bit old school, right? There's got to be better solutions than the old landline. Actually, this reminds me, and we might talk about this when we get to the future part. But I've often joked that we need to feed an AI all the audio from a highly skilled registrar rejecting a study. So all those little manipulative strategies that they use on the phone, like, oh, look, we've only got time to do one of these scans from your unit today. Yeah, which one of your 3 patients do you want us to scan, and which 2 should I cancel right now? Imagine an AI assistant that could speak natural
Oh, that's
language
fantastic.
and argue like a brick wall.
The best excuse I heard to not do an x-ray was by a radiographer it must have been just before they were going home after a night shift. And they got called to do a mobile x-ray up on the ward. And they said, oh, look, I'd love to come up, but we've actually run out of photons and the delivery hasn't arrived yet.
Nuke Med use that all the time, though, with their tracers, but
Yeah.
but maybe that's real.
Maybe.
And then the next one I have here is changes in physical environment as a solution to interruptions. And Dan, perhaps you could talk to this one.
Yeah, sure. I think taking the radiologist away from the expected location, where people expect to come and find them, to somewhere where they can't so easily be interrupted, seems like one of the best solutions for removing both the internal radiology department and external saboteurs.
Sabotage.
And actually, you like that, don't you?
It's a good song.
From there, it's just down to the final point, which is the self-discipline element to deal with the self-interruptions. So really, like by that point, they have no excuses if you've taken them to somewhere different. And dealing with that, I think having periods where you impose upon yourself no messaging, no browsing are quite helpful. So you might set yourself like mini goals to say, I'm going to report 5 MRIs, then stretch my legs, respond to messages for 5 minutes, and then I'll come and get back to the task. It's also been shown that some all-round simpler measures can help. So a tidy work environment, having some ambient backlighting and a lack of noise, even using headphones if you need to, if you can't fully prevent external noises. These are all things that can help you focus. And then, of course, the 20-20-20 rule is good practice for eye health. So every 20 minutes, you take a 20-second break and stare at something which is 20 feet away. And that's just good for eye health for a career-long radiologist. And maybe you can tie it in with your message checking.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about finding ways of stopping yourself from interrupting yourself, because I think we all need to accept and embrace that we're in an eternal fight with our inner monkey brain, and that the monkey's not your friend. It doesn't want to sit and report mind-numbingly boring staging scans. It wants to go out and play and gossip and watch YouTube and daydream and doom scroll and eat chocolates and scratch itself and whatever. And the more you can make your environment do the heavy lifting of controlling your monkey and putting it in its horrible little cage and making it a miserable monkey, the more energy you have left to keep an eye on everything else that's going on.
Dan, when you talk about isolating radiologists in their own environments to avoid the interruptions, are you talking about them being on their own, or are you talking about other radiologists and trainees potentially being in the room with them still?
I think there are a number of approaches to it. So in departments, you can ring fence off protected areas where radiologists can go either themselves or with their trainees to keep the training going. But something we've also done in the UK is a lot of remote reporting. So equipping people with a home workstation, decent connection, and giving them protected time where they can stay there in return for a certain level of productivity. And I think both seem successful. Like, you do have to keep an eye on the training element, and obviously everyone sitting on their own at home is bad for that. But all of the above really help.
One of the things I most enjoy about work is actually, sitting with the other radiologists in the reporting room and interacting with them. So I think one of the things is, thinking about the mental health and the longevity of your career. That's one thing that actually keeps me going to work, is that banter, and it's just trying to think about having some time in a quiet space on your own where you can churn through some what we call bags. Get a lot of bags and a lot of units done, and then other times where you can sit with your colleagues and maybe report at a slightly less efficient rate, but be engaged in what you're doing and the specialty. Now, the next strategy for us to talk about for reducing interruptions is education of people. Something that I think is underestimated and probably underutilized. And Frank, I think this is something that you'd be all for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way of not being interrupted is to help others develop the skills so that they can answer these questions themselves. And I try as often as possible, which I guess in fairness means sometimes, to explain how I'm making a decision when someone comes to me, be that a radiographer or a trainee or a resident from another unit or whoever. The more you do that, the more they will feel capable of sorting it out themselves. And that's not just good from an interruption point of view. It's also upskills and empowers sort of the whole system. Actually, that leads me to a goat. Can I have a two goat episode, Dix?
Yeah, go for it.
This is a big, hairy, stinky, cantankerous goat as well. And that is colleagues who have crazy high and idiosyncratic standards about how they expect everyone else to do their specific little job. This might be how to perform a procedure or how to protocol a study or whatever. And when these standards are inevitably not met, be it by their colleagues or by trainees, then they criticize and complain and undermine. And the result is that everyone in the system feels disempowered. And you feel like there's no point having a go because you can never get it right. And then you're just going to get criticized. So you give up. And so what do you do instead? Well, you interrupt them and you magnify that across a whole department, because it gets generalized. It's not just this person. Then all the radiographers learn that they cannot make decisions on their own and that they must ask. And so they ask everyone everything. And it's so really toxic, and it has to be stamped out. Unfortunately, these people are often the ones that are really good at what they do as well. And so it's a difficult problem to address.
And this is why I never fold my wife's clothes and put them away, because I can never do it correctly. So it isn't worth trying.
There you go.
And that's not just a cop out on my part. No, one thing that I've seen lately from my colleagues is kind of ad hoc education, or, very, very light roasting of the person who's calling you up. So when some clinicians call up and they tell you, I've got this request I've just put in, a lot of our registrars will take the opportunity to politely say, you don't actually need to call up about this. It comes up on our list. We protocol them frequently between the scans that we're reporting. And in fact, it doesn't speed things up by you calling us, and actually it can slow us down. So I've noticed a lot of them doing this, and hopefully that causes some kind of change in behavior in the residents.
I think it does, as long as you can deliver on it, as long as the thing does get protocoled and the report does get issued. We've had periods of time when we're so behind on our reporting that the interruptions skyrocket, because the only way to get your thing reported in time is to interrupt. And that's actually one of the few triage methods we have.
Another big thing that I think falls under education is appropriate referrals and clinical indications. And I think we all often feel powerless, that we're trying to push back on a flood of requests, and it feels like a waste of time because you spend 20 minutes trying to cancel just one study, right? But this role of the radiologist is bigger than just interruptions. This is about, preventing over investigation, wasted resources, incidental findings being found that then prompt further scans. I know I'm, at an academic public hospital, and that in private radiology, more scans is more money. But let's be honest, there's no shortage of studies to report at the moment, and we do need to collectively, as radiologists, I think, work on educating our referrers as often as we can as to what is appropriate use of imaging, because it's, in many ways it has become out of control.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on the pushing back and cancelling studies thing. And it's probably better to try and encourage a culture of education and promotion of correct requesting. And then to give those kind of light roasts. I love that term, by the way. Yeah. But then to actually go on and change the studies to the correct thing, and not really put your foot down and say, and now you must go and request that again. Because that's the territory that you start annoying the referrers. And we know that conflict around rejections, which is a horrible term, is considerable. And do you know that term was basically invented in a haphazard way by one of the RIS vendors? They just put that label on one of the buttons. And from there onwards, I mean, a really long time ago, and from there onwards, reject was the term. And it's an example
it's like a stamp coming down, big red text, reject, isn't it?
But I think, you have to be careful when you bring in technology with behavior and think about some things like this, because that becomes the term that gets used. And that's a really toxic term to use, when really what we're talking about is kind of decline with advice or changing the study.
It's guidance, isn't it? So at the Alfred, we've actually recently introduced a clinical decision support system into the EMR, so that scans on hospital patients can only be ordered if the decision support automated system thinks it is justified. And there's a dashboard that shows how many orders have been prevented and how many studies were changed, for example, from an MRI to a CT. I thought most people in the hospital would just, tick and type whatever they needed to do to get the scan. But to my surprise, it has been producing a modest reduction in scan requests, apparently, and also alterations in requests.
I'm pretty interested to hear about that, because our analysis of clinical decision support software, that it was actually likely to result in more conflict and frustration vented against radiology unless it was really carefully implemented, and probably involving the referring teams to design and author the correct pathways and then model them into the decision trees that power the CDS software. I just don't think I would trust at all an off-the-shelf product. On the other hand, I just can't see hospitals, at least in the UK, having the time or know-how to do a detailed setup and build those decision trees for a good implementation.
Yeah, I wasn't involved directly, but I think the off-the-shelf product was not amazing, but it wasn't a complete basket case, and it took quite a lot of radiologist customization in the lead up before we launched it. I think our department is going to present some of the results at the Ranska ASM here later in the year, so you'll be able to check up on that. But I think one tip, you go straight to the hospital executive with this kind of idea, because you'll never get each medical and surgical
No,
team directly
never.
agreeing to this. You almost need to force them all into it, particularly the emergency and the ICU docs. They were not particularly happy. It's like negotiating with terrorists. You don't do that. You just tell them radiology now has a clinical decision support system. Deal with it.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard a lot of backlash, to be honest. Backlash when they heard it was coming in, people commenting on it and complaining before it had happened. But since it's been launched, I haven't heard any negative feedback about it, which is good.
It's super interesting to hear, and I think I'll have to just look out for your presentation and maybe try that top-down strategy, though not usually recommended.
Yeah. All right. So that leads us nicely into our final category of interventions to reduce interruptions, and that's software and IT related solutions, specifically asynchronous communication methods. Dan, I know you have a lot of experience and interest in this particular area. Did you want to start the conversation?
Sure. Yeah, this is a good topic, and it's something that we implemented in my practice around a year ago with Microsoft Teams. It could be other messaging systems, but that happens to be the one that we widely use across the organization. It was based on some research, and a bit of research that I saw recently, which is really insightful, was from the Journal of Imaging Informatics in Medicine in March 2024. And that basically supported the notion that moving to asynchronous messaging based communication methods reduced the duration of interruptions, at least, if not removing them completely, of course. But it was certainly better than telephone and physical interruptions. There are some downsides to it, or at least some things that we found you needed to consider when you implemented it. It does just buy into that whole instant messaging thing that we're swamped with now. So there's an expectation of very fast responses. That can just be because some people are more into it and faster, or they're more at their desk, whilst others are slower to respond or busy doing physical things like interventions. It can also lead to less autonomous decision making by radiographers, because the radiologists are just more easily reachable, and they know they're on the end of a Teams chat, and so they can more easily defer a decision that they might have had to pull the trigger on before. So I think you have to just be a bit careful about what you engineer, because you make it easier to access people. And that's particularly bad if it extends beyond the workplace and could be seen as a bit of a kind of stealth move. Hey, you can get this on your phone, so why are you not responding even though you've gone home, kind of thing.
Hmm.
But overall, I think we considered it was quite a positive change, but recognized that there are some cultural design steps that we would maybe build in, like educating people on how and when to use Teams. Even basic stuff that, like a standard data set of what to put in a message so that you can effectively respond to it.
Yeah.
You get a lot of these dumb messages that just say, patient 64938. Like, what do you want to do about this one?
You can't act on it, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So it's not just about a software solution. But async methods definitely seemed for us to have the benefit that you can wait until you finish a task before you deal with the message or notification. Basically, I think we've reinvented the pager.
There's some lessons here for people, not just in the work setting, that we really should just get on top of. And that's the idea of a hierarchy of interruption that ranges from an email all the way through instant messaging to a phone call to barging into someone's office. And that each of those levels should be matched to the kind of response and kind of topic you're discussing. And if you're listening to this, mum, messages are not for everything. You don't need to call me about things. Sometimes a delay is okay.
was going to say one thing with the switching to asynchronous method of communication, so typed messages rather than phone calls. One thing to think about is the language that's used in those messages, as you said, the details that you include, but also still being polite and,
Mm.
saying hi. Because, a lot of the times that I communicate with people, particularly on Radiopedia, we use a thing called Mattermost. And I'll often write the message that I intend to send, and then I go back and put at the front, hi Frank, how you doing? Hope you're well. And then at the end,
Yeah.
thanks, and a smiley face or something. And it's kind of like you almost need to put those things there in order to keep the other person on side. You're interrupting them. You can't just be a matter of fact message. Otherwise, you're
Yeah.
likely, it can come off negatively.
Emojis are good.
Emojis are very good.
We had a Twitter post years ago where we came up with how to integrate emojis into as a conclusion for radiology
Yeah.
reports, which
Severity
is
of canal stenosis or something like
that's
that.
right.
Yeah. Should be a list of emojis though that you can't use at work, that are not safe for
Poop
work.
emoji.
All right, it's time. It's time for part 3 of our discussion team, and remember, after part 3, we have a reading from Frank's Harry
Oh,
Potter
God.
knockoff
I'm not
novel.
reading it.
The wait is almost over. So the final discussion is the future. So what is going to happen to interruptions in the future? Will they continue? How will they change for radiologists? So before I get both of your thoughts on this one, I mentioned earlier the integrated automatic examination assignment as a tech solution to reduce interruptions. I think this is something that may actually play a role in the future, at least for a specific type of interruption. So this study was published in the Journal of Imaging Informatics in Medicine in January this year. So what is automatic examination assignment? Well, this is a system that automatically prioritizes and distributes unreported examinations, so in this case it was CTs, to available radiologists based on upcoming patient appointments coupled with an email notification system. And what it tries to do is ensure that the more timely studies are reported first, and hence the number of interruptions from people contacting you to say, please report this case, are reduced. This was a big study, actually. There were 230,000 CT examinations after the implementation of it compared with the pre-implementation scans. And despite a 9% rise in CT scan volume, coupled with a slightly less rise in the number of available radiologists, 8% increase, the mean daily urgent radiology report requests, so the number of times they were asked to report something specifically, urgently, decreased by 60%. So from 25 interruptions a day to 10 a day. And additionally, the mean turnaround time for reporting was reduced both for those with same day appointments and those without. So a positive effect kind of overall. And for the same day ones, it was reduced by 86 minutes. So seems like something for the future, definitely, I would have thought.
So, funnily enough, Dixon, in about 2008, I did my Masters of Medicine thesis on this topic, looking at how you could prioritize outpatient scans based on other things that were already in the RIS,
Yep.
outpatient appointments. Also, just some stats of, on average, how long does it take a patient from this ward to have their radiology report checked by the referring unit? And that modeling it based on that data would have enormous benefits. And it's crazy that in this day and age, when the systems that we use have all this information in them, we still largely report based on when scans were obtained, which is very poorly correlated, especially in outpatients, with when they're needed.
And something like this might also solve the problem of cherry picking those low hanger cases as well. I'm thinking of one particular radiologist in my reading room.
It makes me think, I briefly worked in Corner Brook, Newfoundland 15 years ago. And when I say briefly, I mean, I think it was 9-day locum. It was a smaller practice. It was a community hospital with, I think, only consultant radiologists. I'm not sure they had trainees. And they had maybe half a dozen radiologists. And all that they would do is all the scans were just split up by the first letter of the patient's surname. And so Bob was in charge of patients starting with A, D, M, and T.
Yeah.
And Sophie did B, C, R, and Q. And it actually worked really well because it was a private practice. So there was also the need to balance the fairness so that people didn't cherry pick the quicker, more lucrative studies. The result was that you knew what job was yours. Some of the older guys were like, I'm happy to give up these ones if you want to do the extra work. But it made the work accountable to a particular radiologist who then was in charge of getting it done or finding someone else to do it rather than just at your discretion.
That's a hilarious system. I mean, what do? You sort of go, hey, Frank, I'm winding back a bit this year. Do you want to take cues?
It was very much like that. It was great.
He was only there for 8 or 9 days at Corner Brook, but they've still got a signed photo of him on the wall, I'm sure. He hands them out everywhere he visits.
That's right.
All right, so final question here. What do you think the future has in store for us? Dan, you've probably given this the most thought out of any of us.
Probably too much, yeah. I'd like to see proper recognition of where interruptions actually happen in the radiology life cycle. And it is good to see some of those papers starting to appear around it. But most of them are really, if we narrow it down, in the pre-acquisition administrative end of the spectrum. I think a lot more focus from radiology IT companies should focus on this part of the imaging journey to help productivity and stress levels amongst radiologists. Some of the stuff we've discussed is no doubt useful, like clinical decision support, but I'd probably like to see RIS and order comms vendors actually building like native decision tree building facilities into their software without needing an add-on. I also think that the human factors are important, and empowering and training our radiographers to deal with the majority of the protocoling would be a great improvement. And perhaps if we got on and built these nice decision trees, that would help them, because if it had passed through the decision tree, they could pretty much sign their name against it. Removal of fixed landline phones, I think, would be a good move, or at least blocking inbound calls during protected periods. And instead, we would adopt asynchronous communication methods and perhaps enhance the integration of those into the packs. So instead of it just being teams completely separate and we're pasting in hospital numbers, maybe you could actually have like dedicated in-context sharing of cases. I think you might even get to the point where you can do a video call over a case so that clinicians don't need to do that descent on department. I think finally, the environment, just a commitment from hospitals and radiology companies to build better reporting spaces and to recognize that the quality of life factor is important in people wanting to sit and do the task, and they can't just repurpose broom cupboards for us.
You mentioned that the video calls. What about virtual reality? I know there's been a few studies published on this in radiology. So using like a virtual reading room, will radiologists in the future all have an Apple Vision Pro strapped to their head, Dan?
Yeah, I certainly had a play with it and thought about this task immediately for it. And I think it's novel, but for prolonged periods, it would add quite a lot of eye strain and also strain on the neck muscles. So overall, I just don't think that my facet joints would thank me.
I think there is an optimistic scenario, and I'm not sure how realistic it is. Probably unlikely, I guess, but that with the efficiency gains that are promised and maybe AI can deliver, that rather than reducing interruptions, that we actually make more time for good interruptions. One of my colleagues, who's a chest radiologist, experimented by going to report in a room next to the chest outpatient department during their outpatient clinic and inviting constant interruptions. And his experience from there was that it was fantastic because you got to solve problems and help the clinicians right where it mattered. And that maybe, in a post ChatGPT 8 world, the act of looking and finding the abnormality and being a detection machine sitting in a little dark room is not where radiologists can do their most valuable work, and that we could embrace the idea of being more integrated with treating teams, which would by necessity have more interruptions.
It's a beautiful thought, Frank.
I don't think it'll pan out that way.
No. We should all get our shotguns, canned fruit, and go into the basement.
Well, that's us. We've made it to the end of my 3 parts that I planned out for us. I did get ChatGPT to write a little summary of what we were chatting about here, but I might skip that because I'm very, very excited, Dan, and I know you're very excited too, to get to our special 50th episode reading of Frank's Harry Potter knockoff.
I'm very excited.
Before I do that, I want to thank you, Dan, for being here. It was really awesome to hear your
thank you, Dan.
insights. I apologize for any and all of Frank's interruptions throughout it. So, Gaillard,
All right.
we are going to have a reading from your Harry Potter knockoff novel. I have means and ways of obtaining manuscripts. Now, I didn't want to give away any spoilers to our listeners because, one day this will be published, no doubt. Dan's already pre-ordered a signed copy.
Definitely.
So the passage I'm going to read to our listeners appears very early in the book. In fact, it's the start of chapter 2, Frank.
Oh.
Is everyone ready?
Okay.
I'll try to channel my inner Stephen Fry here. Here we go. David stared fixedly at the windscreen wipers as they swept to and fro, barely keeping up with the rain that had begun falling so heavily. The car was filled with the musty smell of wet wool, his school blazer having become soaked as he refused to walk under the umbrella his father had been carrying. Actually, I don't think I'm doing this justice, Gaillard, but that's fine. That's fine because I actually went and I got a real internationally published young adult fantasy fiction author to record herself reading this for us. So allow me to throw
incandescent with embarrassment right now.
So allow me to throw to the one and only Kate J. Armstrong to continue a reading from Frank's novel. Here we go.
His light brown hair was plastered to his forehead, and occasional drops of water ran from his scalp down under his shirt collar. A number of times already, his father had turned towards David, his face illuminated by the reflected headlights and the dashboard's light green glow, almost said something, and then, perhaps not finding the right words, turned back to the glassy road ahead. "I'm really sorry, David," he finally said. "I really wanted to be there, but then one thing led to another, and before I knew it, 7:30 had come and gone." David said nothing, and with his hands clasped tightly in his lap around the medal he'd been presented, he continued to follow the wipers with his eyes. "You know what it's like when I start drawing. Time just seems to go. I didn't mean to be late, honest. I'd just figured out the facade for that new project I was telling you about, and..." He trailed off, seeing his words were not apparently getting through. They drove in silence all the way back home, the car's lights illuminating the rising garage door and the collection of junk and unused exercise equipment that was stored there. The car's engine quietly rumbled to a halt, and the roller door finally closed, shutting out the sound of the thunderstorm that continued raging outside. The only sound David could hear was the occasional metallic click as the engine cooled. "Please say something," his father's voice was pleading. For a few more seconds, David kept staring ahead. Then, suddenly, as if the words scrambled out of his mouth, each more eager than the next to be heard, and yet each choked by a tightness in his throat, he turned and yelled at his father.
Dun, 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 dun.
Dun, dun.
There you go.
She makes me sound great.
I was going to say just the same,
How's the tension and release there,
She's
Dan?
so much better than you, Dixon.
I mean,
She is a
it's
professional.
going to take a while to arrive from Australia, but I'm really looking forward to that coming.
You're glad you pre-ordered 1,500 signed copies. Yep. Now, Kate is a good friend, and by that I mean she is my wife's friend, but that she occasionally tolerates my presence at events, and she's also, Frank, a book editor. So I thought, who better to provide a review of this scene and your writing style than her? And she's kindly obliged, although I will admit I may have biased her review slightly by providing a little script that ChatGPT wrote for me. So here's your first ever review, Gaillard, of your unreleased novel. Don't be nervous. Here it is.
Gaillard writes with the precision and meticulousness you'd expect of a 50-year-old radiologist. His car ride scene unfolds with clinical exactitude, dialogue flowing like a medical history, laden with halting uncertainty. Without knowing it, Gaillard may just have forged a whole new literary genre, fiction with the absolute barrenness of a diagnostic report.
Wow, that is scathing.
Will that be on the back of my copy in the blurb?
Yes, that's right. Yep, to promote the novel, that's what we're putting from Kate J. Armstrong. So thank you very much to Kate. So she's the author of Nightbirds, by the way, and its soon to be released sequel, which is called Firebirds, F-Y-R-E, Birds, and that's published by Penguin Random House. That's international. Everywhere in the world you can get that book. And she also has a fantastic podcast titled The Exploress, in which she travels through time to explore women's history era by era. And I just want to say that this isn't a paid promotion, but I just think she's awesome. And thank you very much for recording that for us.
Yes, thank you, Kate. Rest assured, I will be reading Nightbirds and sending you my review shortly.
All right, I think it's time to wrap up this 50th episode. Gaillard, how can people get in contact with us?
We are at Radiopedia on X and Instagram, as well as at Frank Gaillard and at Dr. Andrew Dixon. But you can probably most easily reach us by email at podcast@radiopedia.org with any ideas and feedback or, nicer reviews of that paragraph of literary masterwork.
And, Tarig sent us an email, and we've devoted the whole of the 50th episode to him. So definitely worth emailing us if you have any ideas.
And if you want to help support Radiopedia, then you can become a paid supporter via the website or purchase an all-access pass to our online courses and upcoming conference. And in doing so, not only you'll be getting access to all of that, but you'll also be helping us to give free conference access to people in 125 low and middle income regions.
Yes, Radiopedia 2024 is less than a month away, so please do go and register. And don't forget, Gaillard, that we're doing a special 2-hour podcast episode for the conference with guests and with cameras on and everything.
Yes, it'll be very exciting.
And what else can people do to help us out, Frank?
And you can also help out by leaving us a 5-star review in the podcast app of your choosing. And don't forget to pre-order the book on Amazon.
Signed copies. And we'll catch you all again sometime soon in the reading room.
Stay rad, everyone. Stay rad.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That was great.
Thank you.
Bye.